connection. So Rachel Stevens is with us this morning. And Rachel, if you want to come on up. Yeah, please. If you want to just introduce yourself, tell us who you are, and then go around the table and we'll give you quick introductions too.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for fitting me in. So my name is Rachel Stevens. I'm an Associate General Counsel of the Agency of Natural Resources, Department of Environmental Conservation, and I support the Air Division. So I'm happy to provide context for air pollution control requirements.
You want to do this?
David Templeman from Brownington, Vermont. In my Orleans 3 district is Barton, Brownington, and Westmore.
Okay, great.
Henry Farrell, I represent the towns of Danville, Peacham, and Cabot.
Jed Lipsky, Lamoille, on Stowe.
Rodney Graham, represent Orange 3, Williamstown, and Chelsea.
David Durfee from Shaftesbury represents Sunderland and Glastonbury as well.
Heather Supernaut, Windsor 4, Barnard, Pomfret, and Bridgewater.
Esme Cole, Windsor 6, Hartford.
John O'Brien, Royalton, and Tunbridge.
Mike Rice, Bennington, Rutland District, Danby, Dorset, Landgrove, Mount Tabor, and Peru.
Josie Levitt, Randall Chittenden, all of Randall County and West Milton.
Great, thank you. I hope I won't be quizzed on that. So I just wanted to share that, so I'm here on behalf of the Agency of Natural Resources, but the agency is actually neutral on the bill. So I think my role appearing today is just to provide technical assistance to the extent there were questions related to the legal requirements. As I mentioned, as I mentioned to the chair, I reviewed the bill yesterday, and some of the testimony, though I wasn't able to hear the precise testimony that I may be responding to. So I'll just provide a kind of an overview of the state and federal air pollution control requirements that might apply to agricultural equipment, focusing on the sections that would prohibit changing emission control systems. And then if there are questions, I'll try to do my best to answer them or bring them back to the technical staff and get back to you. I should also mention I did provide a written summary of my overview, which I'll share with the committee, and there's some hyperlinks in there for more information if that's helpful. So I'll just jump right in unless there's anything else. Okay, so starting with the Federal Clean Air Act. So Section 203 of the Clean Air Act and the EPA's implementing regulations prohibit any person from knowingly removing or rendering inoperative, which is what we think of as tampering, any such emission control device or element of design in a motor vehicle engine, and these provisions also apply to non-road engines or other requirements. The Act also prohibits installing any part or component intended for the use with or as a part of a motor vehicle or a motor vehicle engine where the principal effect of the part is to bypass, defeat, or render inoperative any such emission control device or element of design. So it's a pretty broad general prohibition against tampering with any device, engine, or component part that's intended to do that. And there are emission control requirements in the Federal Clean Air Act that would apply to agricultural equipment. These provisions can be found in Section 213. And this is where EPA sets emissions and exhaust standards for non-road engines and vehicles. So that's important, non-road versus traditional motor vehicles. So a non-road engine is defined broadly to mean any internal combustion engine, including a fuel system that is not used in a motor vehicle. And a non-road vehicle means any vehicle that is powered by a non-road engine that is not a motor vehicle. The specific EPA exhaust emission standards apply and vary depending on whether the agricultural equipment uses a compression ignition engine or a spark ignition engine, whether the equipment is new or existing, and whether the equipment is mobile or stationary. So there's different standards, there's lots of tables that spell those out, and I've linked the different requirements. The point is there are requirements. So the Vermont Air Pollution Control Law includes additional requirements for motor vehicles that prohibit tampering with equipment or any feature of an air pollution control device. These requirements are set out in 10 VSA Section 567, which states that no person shall fail to maintain in good working order or remove, dismantle, or otherwise cause to be inoperative any equipment or feature constituting an operational element of an air pollution control system or mechanism of a motor vehicle required by rules pursuant to this chapter to be maintained in any vehicle. Motor vehicles are defined in Title 23, VSA Section 4. It includes all vehicles propelled or drawn by power other than muscular power. And I should mention there is an exclusion for farm tractors, but there are other types of agricultural vehicles that are spelled out and defined in Title 23. So just as an overview, the violations of any of these prohibitions against tampering and defeat devices can result in civil or criminal penalties, loss of a manufacturer warranty, loss of insurance coverage, or loss of registration per vehicle that's required to be registered. And I just wanted to mention for context, the EPA has ramped up enforcement of these anti-tampering provisions in recent years. In 2020, EPA issued an anti-tampering enforcement alert and updated its enforcement policy on vehicle and engine tampering and aftermarket defeat devices. So in sum, there are federal and state air pollution control requirements that would prohibit anti-tampering of non-road engines, non-road vehicles, and motor vehicles that might apply to agricultural equipment depending kind of on the type. So that's my overview.
Okay, good, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, questions then?
Sure.
Dave?
So in regards to the exemption in the Vermont statute of farm tractors, would that, I guess I'm asking, what's the definition of farm tractor, and would that extend to, say, logging equipment?
So yes, I can pull up the definition of farm tractor, but one thing to point out is that the federal government regulates non-road engines, not Vermont. And so Vermont's law applies to motor vehicles and exempts farm tractors. So just because farm tractors would be exempt from the motor vehicle definition in Vermont doesn't mean that they wouldn't be subject to non-road engine or vehicle requirements.
With the federal government, yeah, I'm aware of that.
Yeah, I can pull up the definition for farm tractor. So we're in. Should have had it up.
Then maybe when you're looking for it, I could also, then is the agency neutral to this because it doesn't pertain to the law, to the statute?
Right, there's nothing in the bill, as far as I can tell, that would change the existing requirements that would prohibit tampering with an engine or a vehicle.
So you're like.
Yeah, so those would persist regardless of the as far as I understand what's included in the latest version of the bill.
So that also implies then that you're not concerned about people tampering because it's covered by the federal law.
Right, we still have the authority, the federal government and the state government to enforce anti-tampering and still would do that. I can't speak to whether this would increase the likelihood or not of that, but I don't, so I wouldn't be able to speak to that. And just so the definition of farm tractor, if you're interested, is in 23 VSA section 4 subsection 68. And it means a traveling power plant or a self-propelled device that functions as part of crop production, harvesting, feeding, or livestock management, or is used for drawing a farm trailer as defined in subdivision 69 of this section. A farm tractor also means a self-propelled vehicle designed to perform single-purpose functions such as land preparation, crop protection, or harvesting. The term farm tractor shall not include a motor truck, which is also defined. As I said, there are other lists of agricultural vehicles and different types. And so that's why I say it depends on what kind of engine, the horsepower of the engine, whether it's a new or used vehicle, and whether you're talking about non-road or on-road use.
So it may or may not include certain logging equipment or forestry equipment.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, depending on the engines. And there is, I did link to the federal non-road engine emissions and exhaust standards. So, and these engines, depending on, there's lots of information on the EPA website about how this works, but they would, they can certify engines as they're manufactured. So there's kind of requirements on manufacturers to put emissions controls in the equipment. But then there's also this, what we call aftermarket limitations on tampering or otherwise, changing a control device that's in an existing system. But it really depends on the size of the engine, and whether it's on-road or non-road.
Representative Lipsky, I'm sorry, Representative O'Brien did have his hand up earlier. Go with him first.
Do you have an inventory, does A&R have an inventory if the universe is diesel engines in Vermont? I'd be interested to know sort of, what are on-road vehicles, sort of tractor trailers and dump trucks? What are agricultural and forestry? What are the sort of road construction, the municipal front end loaders and graders and things like that. It'd just be interesting to know what percentage we're talking about in the ag world.
Yep.
Ag and forestry.
Yeah, we definitely have that level of data for on-road vehicles, and I'll have to check with our technical staff about non-road. I'm not sure whether we have that information. And a lot of this too is data that we share with Department of Motor Vehicles, but I can ask about that.
And is there a bright line sort of between a front end loader that, the town of Tunbridge is using to, scoop up gravel versus a farmer with the same exact vehicle scooping up silage?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a difference between the on-road and non-road uses of a vehicle, but in terms of it doesn't mean that it's unregulated in terms of the emission control requirements of the off-road vehicle. And that would also depend on, whether the state is asserting emission standards or we're applying the federal standards. So I can try to follow up on that, I think, if that's helpful.
Jen?
There's a date, a timeline in history that sort of changed the world with regard to emissions. And it's somewhere around 2012 with on-road diesel engines, where after 2012, they were required to have diesel emission fluid and a much more complex, cleaner exhaust system. And then within a year or so, that followed for off-road, whether it's on farms, in the forest. Those emissions systems were required on all that equipment. And that's where the computer modular systems started to be added to all these, I'll call them more modern or tier 4 piece of equipment. Mm-hmm. And that seemed to be, so it's really those forward, same with large trucks on the road. That's where this whole tampering issue has come in. Theretofore, whether it was from the 1940s up and through 2010, there were no particulate collection systems with diesel exhausts.
Right, and at least for non-road, I know a lot of that was beefed up in the 1990 amendments to the Clean Air Act. And certainly there are all kinds of ways, tampering is defined really broadly in both the federal and state law, and it could be anything from, messing with the onboard diagnostic or, not using the fuel that might, that's not intended for the vehicle that might change the emission system, or, there's also aftermarket devices that people can buy online that can change the efficiency or the emission control requirement. So there's a whole host of ways that could apply, but that's why the language is pretty broad.
Representative Rice?
Can you share either with data or sort of more broadly or anecdotally how much of a problem tampering is in Vermont? Is it how much enforcement you're doing? Is there a sense that there's more that you don't have capacity to do enforcement on?
Yeah, I don't think I can speak specifically to enforcement. I will say at the federal level, this has been a significant issue. There, in the last 5-10 years, there's been a lot of headlines about, automakers certainly,
I guess more specifically not on the manufacturer level, but
you mean more aftermarket? Yeah. I guess I couldn't speak to that in terms of how much of a problem it is. I can't really speak to that in terms of existing enforcement on that.
Representative Graham?
So on this, the fluid systems, I can assume as part of the emissions. If someone was to take a line apart, clean out a nozzle, that could be considered tampering with the emission system.
So there is a nuance that if you're repairing, a an engine or a vehicle and you get it back into good working order, that wouldn't be tampering. And it also requires it to be kind of knowingly. So that's where I think some of the tampering. So I think it would depend, but if it impacts the emission control system, if it's knowingly and if it's not as a part of a more extensive repair that's going to bring it back into compliance with the control emissions, and that I think that would probably fit into the prohibition.
To follow up with that, I mean, we had someone testify that they had a piece of equipment, the nozzle got plugged in that system, took it apart, cleaned it, but then had to get somebody from somewhere far away to come and reset the system.
Oh, like is this an on-road?
Off.
Oh, off-road.
Clear a code for it
Yeah.
to function again.
Yeah, I'm not sure how that would function in a non-road setting. In an on-road setting, there would be an inspection process, that we have for vehicles in Vermont, so that would catch that. So I'm not sure how that would function. But certainly if it's just I imagine if it's just a signal, but it's actually operating, it's just getting the computer reset, that might be different than whether its emission control system is actually like malfunctioning. So I don't have more information on that.
Representative Rice?
This could just be more information that you don't necessarily have.
No, but I'm also happy to touch base with staff after this if to the extent there's a line of questioning that's helpful.
Yeah, so just wondering if you have within reach what in the overall emissions picture of Vermont, what percentage is caused by on-farm diesel powered?
I can't speak to that. I can see if we have that level of information. I will say that, certainly for heavy duty machinery, tampering and removing emission control systems, again, this for like a heavy duty truck engine can significantly increase the emissions from that specific vehicle. So it can go upwards of like 300 times depending on the piece of equipment. So I can't speak to. I could try to get information about that level
Right.
of the current emission portfolio.
Yeah,
but
just looking to get a sense of sort of we've become very concerned with this bill about the emissions impact apparently, and I'm just trying to get an idea of sort of in the overall emissions picture of Vermont. What
I would say is kind of back to your point that nothing in the bill changes the existing landscape in terms of air pollution control requirements that apply to engines, vehicles, component parts, the prohibition against tampering. And so it could just be a matter of making sure that people that haven't otherwise, repaired a piece of equipment would understand that there are criminal and civil penalties for tampering with a piece of equipment. So I would consider that wouldn't change the existing requirements.
Representative Templeman?
So, and to better define emissions, so are we talking about particulate matter, CO2 increases, all of the above, more?
Yep, I would say all of the above.
Okay.
So those would be the criteria pollutants that we regulate in the Federal Clean Air Act.
Okay.
John?
So how does enforcement work on off-road vehicles as far as complaint driven? I mean, because with our cars or 18-wheelers, et cetera, they all have to go through an inspection process of how they hang this up, but farm equipment doesn't, forestry equipment doesn't.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to speak too far into that without having like our staff that works on that, but certainly there is a, visual, it can be obvious to the naked eye if a piece of equipment is operating. And so we do have, enforcement officers that are in the field. Also, another source of enforcement is actually against, we can, you can even go on some websites and see that there are kind of illegal, what we call defeat devices that are available for sale. So that's another avenue of enforcement, and certainly one that EPA has taken to try to go after the market for those devices so that people, in Vermont wouldn't even be able to actually purchase something like that. And then otherwise, I think, I'd I'd have to talk more to our staff and certainly DMV has their own kind of inspection enforcement team, but I can try to circle back more about that. I should mention there's some general information about this in the some of the DMV, driver manuals and general like public education information. But I don't know specifically about agricultural equipment, if there's kind of an effort to do that, or as you said, what source of the, how big of a quote problem that would be.
If A&R works with the ag dealers for the same, do they flag like, oh, here's a farmer who's obviously been tampering with?
Yeah, I think I'm now wishing that due to our motor mobile sources chief was here, who could speak a little bit more to that. But I could try to follow up with her today and see if I can get you more information about kind of our enforcement landscape on something like that. So it sounds like just so I'm making sure that I'm following up with information that's useful, is you're interested in either what slice of kind of the emissions portfolio we're looking at when we're talking about off-road agricultural equipment, and then also what, if any, enforcement efforts are kind of underway or in place that could address that concern in Vermont. Okay. Certainly keeping in mind too that a lot of the off-road regulation and in general enforcement also comes from the EPA too, but certainly for Vermont, I could try to get a sense of that for you.
Sorry, I've got one more. Are mechanics mandated reporters when they come upon an altered engine?
So there are requirements in the Vermont inspection manual for that. I don't know if I would call it like a required reporter, but there are like requirements for inspection stations in terms of if they identify.
In the off-road realm?
I don't know about off-road.
Oh, okay.
It's a different framework because of the way that we regulate motor vehicles on road versus off-road. So I could try to get more information about that in terms of how they're, like what kind of oversight we currently exercise over them and whether we enforce or how we would flag something like that.
Thank you.
But certainly it is a different framework when, we don't have the same kind of annual inspection requirement.
Just to follow up on Dave's point, are there any inspections then for, this sort of class of, whether it's tractors or,
I'm not actually sure. I don't want to say no just because I'm not aware of it. It's not something that certainly that I've encountered, but I can try to follow up with that more after that. Yeah, I apologize for not having everything at hand.
You mentioned, you used the term defeat devices, and I think we heard that expression yesterday and some suggestion or maybe an implication that the bill would make it more likely that they could be used. The concern was certainly raised that something about the bill would have an adverse effect on air quality in Vermont. And I'm wondering to the extent that
I think, sorry to interrupt. I think my perception of that question, again, and I didn't listen to the testimony specifically, would be if you have a new group of people that are now needing to understand that this is a requirement versus like existing dealers or manufacturers or repair mechanics that might be familiar with these limitations and prohibitions. That would be my perception of that. It would be more of a compliance question, making sure that, compliance outreach education issue than making it more likely. It's still as illegal as it was, it would be still as illegal as it is before or after the bill. But to the extent you're expanding the right of people to repair. But again, A&R is neutral on the bill in terms of its effect on kind of air pollution in general. But.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you for coming in.
Okay, sure. And I'll try to follow up on some of the specifics of Vermont agricultural equipment, and then I'll just share. I did include some links. There are some kind of Northeast anti-tampering information online that might be useful. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we are expecting another witness this morning, but I'm not sure when. Laura, is it
It was between 11 and 11:30, so
Okay.
I recommend taking a quick break and I'll
Okay.
get in touch and I'll be ready